Hello and welcome to our panel discussion with this group called Living into Inclusivity. This is our fourth session of a year-long conversation regarding race, immigration, racial history, and so forth. My name is David Haven. I'm the pastor at Celebration Lutheran Church in East Wenatchee, Washington. We're meeting in this format to do some self-examination regarding race, how we remember our own experiences and interaction with people of color or other cultures, our attitudes, for instance, towards immigrants, our knowledge of the history of racism. We've structured ourselves so that each of us will have some time to participate in this discussion. Today, there will be more of a general discussion. In the past, we've used something called mutual invitation, which gives everybody an opportunity to participate. But today, we're going to have more of an open discussion. We'll be reflecting on the book entitled The Racial Healing Handbook. And I'm just going to hold that up for you. And it's written by Annalise Singh. The chapter we're looking at today is chapter 3, entitled Relearning the History of Racism. And the set of questions that we're going to be looking at are the following. How has knowledge of the history of racism impacted you? How much do you know about your own immigration history? Was your racial identity affected by a pressure to assimilate into the larger category of white? If so, how do you feel about it? Were there costs involved for you or your family? When have you felt like an outsider, even when you've been inside for years? That is, I'll dump you when I don't need you anymore. And who is deemed valuable in our system of legitimate citizenship? Those are a lot of questions, and the conversation could go on for days regarding those, but I've invited the rest of the panel to consider other questions and comments above and beyond these particular questions. But first things first, let's introduce ourselves. And Francis, I'm going to have you introduce yourself, and then using that mutual invitation, just ask the others to introduce themselves.
Sure, thanks. Dave, I'm Francis Twiggs, and I am the rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in Wenatchee, and I will invite James.
Hi, I'm James Allgard, and I'm pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Wenatchee. Sheila.
Hi, I'm Sheila Marie, and I'm a pastor at Wenatchee First United Methodist Church, and I'll invite John.
And I'm John Coleman Campbell, the other pastor at Wenatchee First United Methodist Church. And please, Karen.
I'm Karen Rutherford, and I'm a 30-year plus community member here in Wenatchee, Washington. Rufus.
And I'm Rufus Woods, columnist for Wenatchee World and concerned community member. Thanks.
Thank you. We're missing two of our group today, Laura Shenham from the Cascade Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Tom Nees, who serves with the Serve Wenatchee Valley. So they are usually a part of our panel, and we'll miss them today, but we'll go with the Brady Bunch that we have with us. I mean, thank goodness for that TV show, right? It gives us all an opportunity to kind of go back in time a little bit. Well, let's start with the first question. How has the knowledge of the history of racism impacted you? And I'm going to start out by asking someone to reflect on that. Karen, I'm going to ask you first.
Well, I'm kind of, this is a sorry thing to confess, but I actually majored in American history at Whitman College. Graduated in 1978, tell you how old I am. And during those 4 years as an active American history major, I wasn't exposed to very much in terms of racism or discrimination or different policies. And so that to me was an interesting standpoint in terms of learning so much, which I have learned the past probably year in terms of reading and speaking to people. I went back and I visited before the lockdown, the Black History Museum in Washington, D.C. It was a whole new world to me, a whole new world. It made me realize that we need education. We need to know our history. And that's where I'm at. Oh,
Great. Anybody else want to reflect on that?
Yeah, I was reading through the chapter and thinking about my life and where I first kind of encountered racism and race, and realizing how much I learned not outside of the system, the school system. I learned it, you know, from my mom, who was very tried to be conscious, and grew up in the South. I grew up in a Upper East corner of Tennessee, and it was a really racist area. And even though we didn't use that word, you know, I was very aware of the KKK and what they represented. And so I guess my knowledge of it impacted me in that we were encouraged by my mom to always say to folks when, you know, the kids would tell jokes, and to say that's not an appropriate joke. So to say that. And that usually then just set up barriers, you know, between me and the kids of the neighborhood, because now they couldn't say the jokes that they heard their parents telling. And so that had an impact on me. I also had this, someone gave me a gift of Martin Luther King's speeches that I used to listen to. So that's probably where I heard the word race and racism, just because I used to listen to his speeches as a kid. And, you know, like you'd listen to a song over and over. I would listen to his speeches over and over. And so it wasn't really until college that you know, began to have the conversations more, especially in history classes that, you know, professors would talk about. We had one professor who was trying to get some of the folks in the area, in the Upper East Tennessee area, to understand that that area was very divided, that there was lots of families that fought for the North, and brothers would be on different sides. Some would fight in the Northern Army and some would fight in the Southern Army, and to understand that Reconstruction. And so that's where I really began to learn more about it. And I'd always had an interest in Native American history. And so I wrote papers and started to learn about the policies, the United States policies of genocide, which you know, in the library as a 20-year-old, like one, I can't believe they wrote down that their purpose was if we can't exterminate them, we'll separate them. I mean, just to read the language of official policy was deeply disturbing for me at that time. So that's how I've been impacted.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I would say that I didn't learn a whole lot in school. Most of it came later in life, and often instigated, I'm not sure what the right word is, inspired, it became necessary when getting to know people who were themselves or their families, their people, whatever, who had been victims of racism in the past. as when I pastored a Japanese American church, learned about the internment in World War II. Certainly didn't get that in school, and was vaguely aware of it, but really didn't know what it meant for families and all and people. The one thing I wrote down is the history of racism. Though I don't think racism was a word we used when I was growing up. We used words like prejudice and bigotry, and I'm not sure if that's equivalent or not. So I'd be interested in hearing response from all you as to how those might be different. But those were words that we used and heard, and growing up in a very white community, they were more, we were aghast and opposed to such things, but it was more theoretical than really affecting how we lived or those around us lived. And, we sang that a lot of what we heard was through, I heard anyway, was through popular music of the times, that, sang Blowing in the Wind at church camp and stuff, things like that. Anyway.
That is really true. It really struck me this week while I was reading through this material that racism is a word that didn't come into my vocabulary until just recently. And I was trying to think of what were the words we used. And again, it was prejudice, bigotry, discrimination, but not racism. It was I found that fascinating too. And I've been kind of wondering, how to put that together. And that was kind of the Archie Bunker types. It was interesting to me. That crazy uncle at Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I had a similar experience in terms of, growing up and not really, it doesn't, that word didn't resonate. I mean, that we just didn't discuss it. It wasn't, there were things about racism or discrimination or prejudice, certainly. I remember learning that I had relatives on both sides of the Civil War, and my dad joking about it, and with some of our friends who had Southern leaning, some of our relatives saying it wasn't the Civil War, it was the War of Northern Aggression, and that was and so I picked up on that. But I think how it's impacted me is I've last couple of years I've spent a fair amount of time trying to educate myself and reading about what happened to Native Americans and in the tribal schools that were set up, and interviewing folks who'd been through those and who had experienced and shared those experiences. And I think that those contact points for me were really important to just say, wait a minute, what's really happening here? What is still happening? What remains unresolved in the society, and how best to try to, do we just sweep it behind us and hope and try to go forward, or do we need some acknowledgement of that? And I just I'm the belief, after reflecting a lot on that we need to find ways to acknowledge what occurred and the impact and the threads that continue on, and work to try to make for a more just society. I just don't think letting it go and pretending it didn't happen is helpful, because it just basically whitewashes a lot of really ugly stuff. And I remember interviewing a Native American chief from the Okanagan, and who was at the school you know, in Espelum and what he suffered in beatings and the having to pick a name out of a hat, you know, for your name, right? Because your Indian name, I mean, and it was just, you know, that stuff really, you know, it's the stories that deeply affect and remind us, I think, remind me of, you know, and I think I need to know that because that was just totally not my experience.
It seems though that thinking, you know, what we didn't get told in school or as a kid, whatever, and we come as adults, we've come to find out, you know, that our founding fathers of our nation weren't as holy and whatever and perfect in every way as maybe we've been led to believe. Kind of like some of those characters in the Bible that we got in Sunday school, who they were all fine, upstanding, faithful people, and when we actually study the material, we find out they were quite flawed, many of them, and that is disorienting, I think, and to have to somehow think again about who those people were, and can be quite difficult, I think, if those images are sacred and all.
You know, that reminds me, John, of some of us go along with the Revised Common Lectionary in terms of our scripture readings for the week, and this past week it was the parable of the tenants, and the three servants who were given, you know, different talents, that is monetary resources to care for and to invest, and two of the tenants did pretty well. You know, they invested, and the master came back and said, "Hey, enter into the joy, you know, into my joy." Third one buried it. Third one buried the talent. And to me, as I reflected on that particular story, it was as if burying a story. and I think there's something to that if we sweep things under the rug, it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't reveal anything. It just sits there. And to me, in that, reflecting on that question, how has the knowledge of the history of racism impacted me? There's times when I just feel like I've been duped. It's like, man, if I had known a little bit more about that, maybe I'd have been different, you know, who I am now. But that telling the story is a releasing way to release and to free, I guess, rather than to bury and to let it sit there and not go anywhere. So that's what I thought of when I was reflecting on this question. Of course, us pastors have to reflect on this every week. So that happened to be very pertinent to me this week.
And I appreciate greatly being able to interpret these different stories in different ways, because I'm preaching on it too, and went in a bit different direction. But if I may briefly, and then I'll shut up. But the one guy who buried his talent, he says he was afraid.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, if we feel in this conversation or other conversations on this subject, if we somehow feel like we're under attack or something that we're afraid of, maybe we're more likely to bury whatever it is rather than deal with it. Anyway, I thought.
I agree that what a great parable for that. I do feel like we've kind of in my experience stumbled upon things. You talked about, you know, the sweeping it under the rug and then kind of picking up the rug to clean a little bit, and there it is. I was just looking up the one that really surprised me that I had known nothing about was the Tulsa race riot, race massacre, because it really wasn't a riot, it was a massacre that occurred in 1921. And I knew nothing of that. And when I did just a little bit of reading on it, I was, wow, you're right. How would that have changed me had I known that, studied that, perhaps in high school? I don't know when, but just spoken about it at some point in time. I stumbled upon the internment camps when I lived in Cody, next to Powell, Wyoming, which is where Heart Mountain is, a large internment camp. Had really kind of heard about them, but didn't really know the history until I lived there. So it is that kind of lifting up the rug and stumbling upon it. And I really do feel like we need to lift that rug up. Yeah. Sweep it out and talk about it, deal with it.
And just and recognize that someone threw that rug down over it. I mean, you know, because other folks lived through it. You know, the Black community lived through that riot. I didn't know anything about it until I watched the HBO series of the Watchmen, and they reenact, you know, put it in that it was a, you know, it's a based on that cartoon, the not well oh, what are those? I don't read them.
Marvel
Marvel comics.
Comics. And so I started Googling that and then, you know, learning about it. And I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, there's so much that folks have distorted, thrown rugs over. You know, John, you were talking about, and you, David, about stories and how we have to be willing to hear a different version of the story. I grew up on this, you know, I used to read these biographies and I used to love the story about Kit Carson. I just thought he was such an adventurer. I mean, this is a kid's biography that they tried to teach people history. And then in college, I was like, oh my gosh, this man was a monster. You know, as a kid, I had this, just like the, you know, kids' Bible stories, I guess, this presentation of this, guy in a coonskin cap that was really, really cool. And then I learned just how horrible he was with Native Americans. And I had to readjust my understanding.
James or Sheila, you want to comment on this question?
Yeah, for me.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I mean, goodness, a lot of reactions through the question, I think, about how this kind of unfolding of knowledge really, it's like, whoa, right? It kind of washes over me. And I think shame is one of the emotions that comes, and feeling badly about being it's such an easy inheritance to pick up, and that of privilege, really. And the idea that through my position or through the position of, you know, what I represent, you know, we can get the choicest, we can get the best, the most, the best deals, you know, things like that. It's just the way is just so easy. And so then I guess that feeds into, for me, the concept of scarcity thinking, because I think that a scarcity mentality helps to fuel that fire of fear. But for me, I think where the grief or the shame really comes into play is that the system that I either complicitly or actively participate in actually creates scarcity for others. It's not that it's a scarce world, but that, you know, this system helps to create scarcity. So I think for me, the challenge is actually getting through or past you know, those negative feelings, those feelings of guilt and shame, and trying to figure out, is there anything that I can, by myself, is there anything that I can do? Or is it just a problem that just simply exists? And then of course, obviously, how can I be in relationship with those who have been abused and oppressed by these systems? I've become a real big fan of James Baldwin, and tried to catch some of his interviews from when he was living. And one of the things that he said is that the Negroes, that's the terminology of that time, the Negroes have to live where the white man puts them. And just that simple statement, it's like, oh my gosh, really? I guess that still, we hand over the opportunity, right? Our language, our whole presentation of ourselves with our neighbors needs to be entirely different. If we were to be able to redo history, how could we have made it? How could it be more equitable across all peoples? And I have a Viking heritage, which is all about conquest, being the conquerors and having and taking what is not yours. So there's something genetic that runs very deep in me. Okay, Sheila, get me off the hook.
Well, I didn't go in that direction. So, although here's what sits in my mind as I listen, because I would echo a lot of what I've heard said, is we don't know what we don't know. So speaking for myself, I didn't know what I didn't know. I grew up typical history, so didn't learn anything in school. Went to a college that was probably about 30% Black, but it wasn't, I don't remember conversation in any context. To me, it was just another group of people. So there's a naivete that came with me up through that point. And my exposure was through things like that have been mentioned, music or news or places where there was an awakening of thought, but not necessarily anything in terms of education. So, and I'm a story gal, so I can remember seeing and reading the book Roots or Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, or going to places around the country, historical places around the country. But still, in terms of conversation, I just don't remember having that conversation other than in the context that's been mentioned. Prejudice or bigotry, or, oh, isn't that a terrible thing? A level of awareness that didn't really move to an actionable place, which is where, James, your thoughts begin to really resonate. I could feel those kinds of emotions and remember them from back in the day, but here I am today wondering where it stopped for me or why it didn't continue. I have a former sister-in-law who married a Nigerian Black, Isaac, and we lived in Plainfield, Illinois at the time, which was about this big compared to the Chicago area. And you didn't talk about those kinds of things. Thank you. I'm like, don't y'all think it's going to be obvious if he's living here that he's the only Black man in the space, kind of thing? And even then, no conversation. A stepfather who was incredibly prejudiced and very, sorry, Dad, Archie Bunker-like in his thoughts, and no opportunity to discuss or ask questions or push. Just no educational background is really where I fall with that. And so if you don't know, it's really challenging to find your way through to ask the questions that would move to a place like the conversation that we have now.
One thing I want to mention in this particular chapter, there's 3 main sections, and one of them has to do with how people of color were identified as inferior to white people. And so that's one part of the chapter. Another one is how colonization overpowered people. And another one, how immigration, while there was a sense of trying to assimilate into the country, but once assimilated, that only went so far before deportation occurs. And that was a pattern throughout our history. So those are 3 of the kind of a main sections of that particular chapter. And I think we're going to get into that maybe a little bit later, but before we go on to the next question, just wondering if there's any other comments on this particular part of the chapter on racism and that history of colonization, whites being superior to people of color and so forth.
One thing I would offer in terms of education is Isaac, former brother-in-law, a lovely, gracious man who would answer any question that we had and immigrated here, first generation in his family in the country. And I am incredibly blessed to know people who are like that. So but in the learning curve, it never went to racism as such. It was just a get to know you one-on-one kind of thing, which isn't necessarily conducive to understanding the wider conversation.
Yeah, I'd offer that, as I think about this issue, but I think about the notion of meeting people where they are rather than where I am, right? And how used to kind of, I've got my little world and I've got my views, and I tend to hang out with people with my views. And one thing just it's made me far more aware of is that there are a lot of different life experiences out there in society, in our communities. Whether it's I was talking with a couple of parents of a trans kid and their experiences yesterday, and it's just you can't really know until you really kind of walk in their shoes and create and come at that, I think, with a sense of curiosity rather than judgment. And so I think it's just reminds me that in a lot of people are otherized in lots of different ways, economically, because of kind of who they love, because of what religion they happen to practice, whatever. The practice of meeting people where they are and with a sense of curiosity, just that's the thing I really try to think about in terms of how I can kind of approach the work that I do and the relationships I have is finding ways to bring curiosity to whatever area of difference, political, social, whatever. That's I think that's something that I've taken away.
So you probably should have been named Curious George.
I've been called more curious.
Curiouser and curiouser.
Yeah, that's good. Curiosity doesn't always kill the cat, right?
I hope not.
Well, I think I learned about colonialism in my couple years in Africa too, more than learning about the American Revolution or something like that. But colonialism, what I learned anyway, it was kind of like the model of learning that I grew up with, was that you have a teacher and the teacher has a relationship with each student, but the students don't have relationships with each other, which makes this conversation antithetical to that model. The mother country has an economic relationship with the colony, but the colony that's next door that has a different mother country, Portugal and France and Britain and whatever, they have their own particular spheres. But next, you have a country next door that we have no relationship with. Everything flows between the colony and that mother country. So it kind of forces the countries in Africa to be divided against each other. And if the more divided they can be, the better it is. If this tribe is at war with that tribe, that's great with us. if we're the colonial power. But if they start getting together and talking with each other and working together, that's trouble.
So divide and conquer is a real thing.
Yeah.
Well, the next question we could is, how much do you know about your own immigration history? But I think coupled with that is the next two questions go along with that. And so I'll just read that again, those again. Was your racial identity affected by a pressure to assimilate into the larger category of white? So there's an assumption in that first question that we are all immigrants. And along with that assumption, how have we been assimilated into the culture that we came to, or that our ancestors came to? And many of us have already talked in past times about where we came from. My grandparents on the paternal grandparents came from Norway, and immigrated in the 1800s, homesteaded in 1905 in North Dakota. And that second question, and even the third question, how do we feel about that? I often think of being on the farm and going out in the field and doing farm work and finding artifacts, Indian artifacts, all over the place, and thinking that there was a people here before I was here. And I always questioned that, but those people then were only 5 miles away from me on a reservation. They weren't all across the land. And so I really felt at different times of being an invader. And it just was an odd feeling to know that I was on the land that was sacred to a peoples that had been there for thousands of years. So that was just my short introduction to immigration history, but how it affected me. So go on, take care, or take it away, people.
Well, I'll follow with the Norwegian line here. How it affected me was that, interestingly enough, 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in Norway, but nobody speaks Norwegian. I mean, my mother they were huge families too, but they were told they were to speak English outside of the house, and they were Americans now, and their traditions changed and the things they did changed. And yet they obviously a lily white family with, blonde hair, blue eyes, or blonde hair, brown eyes, but very much so. So the assimilation even worked for them in language, in culture, in the way they did things. So the only constant was probably the Lutheran Church and Sons of Norway. But still, I just really started to discover bits and pieces of my Norwegian heritage outside of Lutefisk and Lefse, which I've really enjoyed. I've gotten to know cousins in Norway, and even my cousins in North Dakota, and that's been really meaningful to me. And I'm white, so I shouldn't have had this problem, but it's been comforting for me to know more about who I am. I'd love to be able to speak a little Norwegian. I probably won't ever speak very much, but
Maybe James and I can help you with that.
Good. Beyond Ufta. Okay. Yeah. No. So there was assimilation in my family too. It was whenever I would ask my mother, just anything about Norway. Obviously it must have been fresh in their home, and my mother would just not even talk about it. That was just that's not even where we're at. It's fascinating.
Most of my family that I know of anyway, we can go back several generations, but I don't know if we can get back to Europe from the late 1700s. We've got family in this country, and they were largely English or Scottish, so they weren't having to necessarily learn a new language. But we do have one story of being denied citizenship in our family. My grandmother was Canadian, and her history was she was a Mennonite who married my grandfather, who was a Methodist minister. So she became a Methodist, but raised as a Mennonite. And during World War II, she applied for US citizenship. And the immigration officer asked her, this is the way my grandfather told the story anyway, asked her, can you take a gun and shoot a man? And she said, no. And he said, citizenship denied.
Wow.
And she never applied for citizenship again. She lived in this country for 50 some years, but remained Canadian citizen. And I suppose that was a version of, will you defend the country or something that I think people who want to be citizens get asked. But and the immigration officer apparently was a member of their church too, and knew her background and asked the question the way he did because he didn't like pacifists during World War II.
Wow.
Oh, that's leaving us speechless.
Yes, it is. Wow. But you're right, John. I think the question is couched in a different way in the citizenship test that people have to take. They have to learn the 100 questions, which, by the way, there's a push now to increase the number of questions that people have to take the citizenship test. And some of the questions are a little more difficult. And so it's becoming more difficult to study and learn and to become a citizen in this country based on some of the questions on the test. Just something to think about. Rufus, looked like you were ready to talk there.
Yeah, just I don't know a lot about my mom's family's history. I remember in my father's family, my two aunts, my dad's two sisters did a genealogy study, and I think we came from, we were fleeing conscription in Germany way back. I can't remember when, but we were draft dodgers, I guess, back in the day. But we don't really have a ton of I've never really spent a lot of time thinking about that question of kind of where we've come from, and so what that journey was like and how that impacted. I just for me, I just don't have the context to really kind of apply there. But that just it's not something we've spent a lot of time thinking about.
I think for me, the immigration story is quite a lot. It has to do with seeking opportunity. So, but it's a little bit complicated because on the Swedish side of the family, at that time when my grandpa was growing up, it was very much economic class and pretty much a functional caste system in Sweden. And my grandpa and his mom being the only people in the household, they really grew up in an impoverished situation, very little to live on and to work with. And so America fever is what they called it, the urge to try out this new land, new opportunities. So that's what he struck out to do. And then my grandpa on my dad's side, I know more about my grandfather's histories than I do about my grandmother's histories, unfortunately. But his father, my great grandpa, was a little bit more of a landowner, and over the course of many decades allowed local people to build a home on his property and basically just kind of sectioned out or carved out chunks of land so that these people had something. So he was actually, in some sense, a benefactor. But yet my grandpa was oldest in his family, but he still saw the need to come to America for an opportunity. I don't feel like it would be a stretch to interpret any kind of racism in that story. There's a lot more to share about those stories, I guess, but yeah, I think I know quite a lot. I'm kind of the historian of my family. After my aunt died, I felt like that mantle was placed on me.
And so what are you doing to pass it on to the next generation? And are you telling the story differently than you received it?
Yeah, that's a good question. My daughters hear about it, or hear those stories often. And I think it's been, so another piece of my family's kind of narrative now is that our family is in a way moving off of the farm, or away from the farming culture, farming lifestyle. And so that change, I think, has been really an interesting one. And so, as life goes on, it continues to be interpreted in new ways. But for me, where I grew up, migrant workers, Hispanic migrant workers, was actually a big piece of our local economy. And so now, where I am at least reinterpreting how life was back then for me as a teenager, and some of the attitudes that I had that were really, really racist and very inappropriate. I was kind of a bully back then. So to fess up to that is a big piece.
Kind of hard to believe, James, but I'll take your word for it. Just a note on your question, John. In our family, we've been very fortunate to keep ties with our Norwegian relatives, and I've been back several times and know. In fact, my sister and her family all live back there as well. But our son and daughter have been able to travel with us back to Norway and meet their generation of folks. And so there has been a continuum from the time that my grandfather came here in the late 1800s, which has been really good to have those ties back to the old country. So just a note on that. Anybody else on that question, or do you want to move on to another question?
So I guess just to follow up on that, David, that part of the violence and of racism has been to separate people from their history, especially those who were brought as slaves.
Right. Well, and to Karen's point about not speaking Norwegian, for instance, outside of the home, that too was part of our history. I mean, there were people wanted to be Americanized, so to speak, not to speak with an accent, but that became almost impossible, especially now if you visit back to North Dakota and Minnesota. The accent is still there. But again, I refer back to even this conflicting feeling growing up near an Indian reservation, where it just seemed unfair that we were living on the land, that we claimed the land, that we colonized the land that we had no right to. It's just been tough to reconcile.
I don't, on my father's side, the history of their coming over was so far back that I don't know anything other than the fact that they have got land, like I suppose a lot of people did, because they were coming, and so they had that. They were landed people, got property in South Carolina, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia area, and that's where the family cemetery is outside of, is in Savannah, Georgia. And my mom then, she immigrated. So it's her experience of coming, an English woman, white woman. So so having an impact on immigration through race, no, but she certainly felt it for her an impact of just coming into the area of Tennessee that she came in at the time. You know, anybody who wasn't from that area. And I spoke with other friends who said, shoot, our family came from such and such North Carolina, and we were considered outsiders. Yeah, because they didn't have a history of that could go back generations of the Upper East Tennessee. So she definitely felt, you know, the sense of being outside the culture.
Well, let's explore a little bit about this other question. I'm gonna. Well, Francis, it has to do with that involvement of being an outsider. You know, when have you felt like an outsider when you've been on the inside for many years? I mean, have any of you felt that way, that you've been inside but have also felt like an outsider, and how that can relate to race? And is there any way that we can empathize even with people of color or people of different races, or are we just two ships passing in the night? Anybody want to tackle that one? Sheila, let's have you tackle that one.
I think about this, just to connect back briefly, I have no idea. My cultural identity, as I know it, has to do with where in this country I was raised and grew up, as opposed to generations back. And the historians who could tell me those stories are all gone now. So Midwestern gal, and in the context of outside or inside, for me, that's always been economic. Came up in a family of blue collar or laborer or farmer, farming kinds of communities, and loved all of that, and didn't feel the press of that until I moved from country to city in junior high. And suddenly there was, oh, here's the gal with all the homemade clothes versus all the best shoes. But that's the most significant context I can think of, really, in the moment. And it seems so small relative to what we're talking about here, that I feel like I don't have words coming to mind to articulate that better, except that it's just the tiniest step towards how I might understand what that looks like in this much, much greater context. So pretty humbling, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. It seems like what you said was, yeah, it's just a tiny, sometimes we just get a little bit of what it might feel like. Karen.
I say I feel the same way as you, Francis. My father was military, and that did come, especially in the era of the 60s and the when I was a youth, in terms of in and out. That was not a good time to be military. It's not a good time to have your brother and your father in Vietnam. This is also very small compared to what anyone, you know, that is Black or Latino, is what they have gone through, or Chinese. But it was, you know, we were shunned by family members, and when my father was in Vietnam, and just that type of thing. That's my small part of my world, to be able to empathize in terms of who I am and what my makeup of my family is. But yeah, I can't imagine it, that being a legacy that goes back generations. I can't imagine. I've been blessed.
Rufus, I'm thinking about you being a publisher of a newspaper, and your history, your dad, grandfather, whatever, goes way back, and you've been involved with this community forever. But do you ever feel, because of your position and the way that the newspaper has to establish itself in a community, do you feel like an outsider or an insider? Personal question there, but has that been a part of
Yeah,
your experience?
yeah. I was a kid but not kid that my grandfather and father could have set a little lower bar in terms. They did cut a wide swath. I think that question from a personal standpoint, there are always ways in which I think, just because of my personality, I don't feel like I really fit in typically to kind of normal kind of groups. So, but it's, Sheila was saying it's really minor compared to, the things we're discussing, but I think it does, I think it has given me a bit of just an inkling, a glimpse of in those experiences, where what that's like, and the sensitivity to the need to make people feel comfortable. I think for me, I've tried to be someone who makes people feel as comfortable as possible, because I'm sensitive to that. I want people. That's just been this part of my DNA, and so so I've had some of those experiences. They're not, profound. They're more internal dialogue, if you will, where, yeah, I just don't seem to fit in here. But it's every bit as real in that perspective, because I think that's, it's what, encouraged me to get involved in this conversation, was just wanting to, explore more and kind of go deeper inside and outside towards trying to understand what other people's experience is like. And I think that just as a practice, that's just something we all can do. I mean, it's one thing to say this is kind of a human experience, and I think, yes, these things go back, racial history and other history of otherization, it's got a long history, but that doesn't mean we have to accept it or just say, well, that's just the way it is. I think it's, so what do we do about that, and how do we make a contribution? What are we called to do to try to create meaningful either opportunities or allow people to try to understand where people are coming from, and stand up for folks who might otherwise not have anybody standing by them.
Yeah. I know there's 5 of us who are pastors in this group. And what you were saying, I kind of resonate with myself. I don't know if the rest of you did, but sometimes feeling and as an outsider, even within our own parishes, because of the nature of our vocation. Anybody want to comment on that?
I thought you were going to say Rufus and Karen were outsiders in this group. But,
My
I
family
would think-
and I have been here a long time, Pastor, and we're gonna outlast you.
Yeah.
I was here when you came, and I'll be here when you go.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But Rufus, I would think in your line of work that you, and being a curious person, you want to be able to get in, at least to understand somewhat, the different groups in the community. And I don't know if sometimes they say, no, we don't want you even for a moment in our group, or how that works.
Well, I can say that people have been very welcoming when I've tried to get below the kind of surface level and try to understand, just the family with the trans son. What's the experience like? What process do you go through? And to try to, how do I fairly and thoughtfully, and how do I accurately and adequately kind of express that? Because there are ways to express those truths that can be damaging, right? Like we can talk about race, or we can talk about transgender, we can talk in ways that are not very, very helpful, right? And so trying to find ways to, so people have been very open and willing, and I think it's about being authentic and honest and trying to just be a, to full accurately tell that story. That's been helpful. I don't always get it right. I'm sure at times I've probably done more damage than I wish to, but not intentionally. And I try to hold myself to that standard. But people have been pretty open, and again, my work and my writing has given me a wonderful gift of being able to do that. But I also feel a great burden of doing it well and being, and capturing not just the words, but the essence of that. And I think I'm trying to do that more with, I can see there are ways in which I kind of congregate with certain people, and I'm trying to make inroads and trying to find ways to be more consistent, I guess, and again, try to meet people where they are, even though it may not be where I am.
You're not pretending to be something you're not, though, either, in order to get in.
No.
Like that woman in Spokane a few years back who pretended to be Black.
No.
Have
not done that.
No. And I don't know, maybe she had good intentions. I don't know her whole story, but maybe she didn't like being who she was. But
to localize this a little bit, just before the zip code or the area codes were changed, I often heard about the 206ers. When I moved here from the Midwest, it was the 206ers. Too many of those are coming over to the east side, or there's too many Californians coming in, and I still hear that. And so there's this isolationism that really, I think, is present in our community, because we don't necessarily want those outsiders to come in because they might influence us in some way that we don't want to be influenced. Any comments about that?
Well, as a Methodist who has moved more than you have, I think most everywhere I've been, there's been that.
Is there? Yeah.
I've enjoyed Emmett Watson, the late columnist for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, had this Lesser Seattle Society. And he come to Seattle, but for God's sakes, go home. I do think that's, and that's part of things changing. It disrupts people, it disturbs people, it's uncomfortable, and we certainly see plenty of evidence of these kind of conflicts or concerns here in this valley, in this country.
James, you looked like you wanted to comment on that, just by the curiosity in your eyes.
Well, I was thinking about the identity of as a pastor, minister, and I have the honor, the privilege of mentoring interns, pastoral interns, and so here in this call, I think I'm on to number 6. So, but for every single intern, I reflect with them to say, in a way, our schedule is inverted from the typical or the rest of the regular community, and we feel the busiest when we want to provide the most comfort and joy and comfort food for our folks around the special holidays, things like this. And so there's this real feeling of being separate or separated, I think, in the midst of community. And so there's a loneliness factor that comes into play in ministry. And then also ministry has so much to do with intangibles, meaningfulness, joy, peace, comfort, things that you can't really quite touch. And so we have to have a certain level of comfort in the intangibles. And then, honestly, we get a little nervous when things start to become a little bit more tangible. But on the other hand, we want our folks to move out, right, past the intangible and into tangibles, right? To do justice, for example, and that's a tough one because I think that it has the potential of being very much divisive. Yeah. So anyway,
Thank you.
It's hard to absolutely. It's tough to, apples and apples. I can't presume to have the same kinds of same depth, I guess, of pain or experiences that I know that non-white folks do.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's a very good analogy, but pastors are always outsiders, and like doctors and psychologists, whatever, your client, your patient is not your best friend, though they may think you are. They may think of you as a friend, but you're not. And yet, though an outsider, I have been honored and privileged so much that in times of grief and catastrophe, that individuals and families have felt that I'm invited into their home and into their lives at some of the most important times of their lives.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think we've all touched on this, that we can't relate. These are little things compared to what a person of color may experience. But that's part of this conversation, is let's at least try to internalize within ourselves and in this conversation to lift up those deep-seated realities or feelings, along with reading the history. And that's what the history of racism was what this chapter was about. And so just trying to bring up some of our own deep-seated feelings and alongside what the history is that we may or may not have known, I think is important. But the last question I think we need to look at is, who is deemed valuable in our system of legitimate citizenship? As I mentioned before, this chapter talked about colonization, talked about immigration, citizenship, and so forth. And oftentimes, who is legitimate? They reference Asian Americans, they reference, people of color, African descent, Mexicans, and so forth. And when, who is deemed valuable and for how long? So let's talk about that a little bit.
So I think that the other word that goes along with that word is valuable is belong. I think that if we see someone who we see as that belong here, then then we see that person as valuable. I think that's something. I think we all want to belong. We all want to belong somewhere in whatever, in the communities that we go to or reside in. This whole kind of idea of belonging. And when do people feel they belong? When do they feel we belong? And, you know, people who belong, what can they say? What kind of envelopes can they push? As opposed to those who we don't really belong. And you just crossed the line.
What are some of the things, Francis, that you could think of that would deter people from feeling they belong?
Oh gosh. Gosh, if I put in the context of the church.
It's okay. That's where we live. That's our life.
Just that whole kind of thing about, like, you know, as I was saying the other day, oh, so-and-so sat in my pew, you know. Oh, I didn't know you paid for that. Those kinds of, that's when people know that they've crossed that kind of a boundary, is when they get that kind of that look, or you haven't, or what do you mean this is what we always do? You know, let's say someone coming into a family even, and that family says, okay, this is how we're doing Christmas. And then that person says, well, we do it this way. You know, and then when do they get to belong enough to be able to say, yes, we'll incorporate, you know, your experience into ours.
I've got a T-shirt that on one side it says, you know, the 7 last words of the church. We've always done it this way before.
Right.
And on the back side, it's the lyric of a hymn, "Ponder anew what the Almighty can do," which kind of contrasts the two. Anybody else on that question? It's an important question.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in. I think so. Think about like South Wenatchee, for example. Think about South Wenatchee. You know, for years has been an area that has been kind of ignored by city government, you know, a high poverty area, a large Latino population, very young, and I just, you know, the sense of belonging. I mean, it was heartening to me to see people in the city over the past, and there have been a number of attempts. It's not just one attempt. It's been, but ways in which the people of the city really tried to you know, I think Steve King spent a lot of time when he was here, walking around, talking to people. You know, there are a whole bunch of different efforts, and Karen knows way more about that than I do, but efforts to what do you guys need and how can we help? And I think that was missing for a long time. It was that's a place you don't go to, and it was pretty much out of sight, out of mind, and attention's elsewhere. And I think about the notion of belonging that Francis was talking about. I think is the critical question: creating a community of belonging. Where are areas in which people don't feel like they belong, and how do we you know, find ways to make it about all of us rather than just some of us? And so yeah, I've been excited about what's happened at Quantas Park, and the way that the ag industry has helped support that effort, and other businesses, and how you know, it's you know, there's this, you know, more of a sense of belonging, and how many folks, once you invite people, we've always heard they won't participate. You know, the Parque Padrinos, they're more than 100 active members who are godparents of the park, you know, and I just think it's again, for me, heartening, and it shows, you know, if you just make the attempt, if you just honestly meet people where they are, things can move forward. And I've been, and I think there are now other attempts to kind of start to really honor the Native American history here, and Randy Lewis and the work he does with the museum and others, starting to see that happens as well. I think those are really important, essential, and I think they're also reminders that everybody's valuable, right? Everybody, not just some people.
Karen, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I'm going to say, Rufus, I agree with you. To me, really brings what you've just said really brings us really home to today, and what is going on in our community right now, and how we can be that active, curious supporter of all of our residents here. And when you talk about the sense of belonging, I've spoken to some that are dreamers. They're DACA. And they are, again, we appreciate them when they're doing what we want them to do. And yet when they're, want citizenship, then, out the door we go. And so it's figuring out how to support those people that we feel are valuable to our community, and we need them here. That I think it's really prevalent right now in terms of our Latino community. It's that also that welcoming them. Well, they're growing up. I mean, their children are growing up. They're going to college. They're going to trade schools. They're getting, they're infiltrating our community in a positive manner. And yet I still hear some people say, "Oh my goodness, my doctor was a Latino," and it would kind of worry in their voice. And I think to myself, oh my, oh my, or all the bank tellers are Hispanic. And I think to myself, oh my, we need, those are the simple, I don't assume they're not simple, but they're complicated, but yet they're simple in terms of accepting. This is such a good thing. This is such a wonderful thing to have happening, to watch the South Wenatchee businesses grow and thrive, and watching our DACA recipients become intensive care nurses and doctors and lawyers. And these are things to celebrate in a community. And so I guess that's it. I've really, to me, that how do I then help that? How do I help celebrate it? How do I turn the conversations around to celebration and move forward? That's my one thing, strong thing right now at this moment, is how to be part of that positive goodness. So, but yeah, that's really true. I think it can only be good. So, but it's hard. It's still out there.
Very hard, very difficult when we think about who's legitimate, who's not. Are the farm workers, the factory workers, the service industry workers? How much bang for my buck can I squeeze out of them before sending them back to where they're supposed to be? Those are legitimate questions.
We saw it with COVID. When the first large population of those who got COVID and went to the hospital were our ag workers and our Latinos. And I would hear it in the Valley all the time. Well, they're not really Wenatchee people. They're, those are other people that are sick. Oh boy. Yeah. They're us, they're us. And we need to figure this one out.
We are us, yeah.
Yeah.
Comments, we're getting close to our time where we've covenanted to keep this at about an hour and a half. But any follow-up comments, questions?
I guess the last question reminds me of a gal I knew, Japanese woman who'd married an American serviceman. And they had some children together, and the marriage fell apart, and she wasn't a citizen, but felt like she couldn't get out of the relationship, which was abusive and violent, because she couldn't get a job and be in the country and things like that. So She went back to Japan and took the kids with her. The husband wrote letters, I guess, through her family and said, you know, I promise things will be different, come back, we'll start over and all that. And some months later, she came back and she was arrested as soon as she got off the airplane, that he had gotten a divorce that he hadn't mentioned to her while she was away, and got custody of their kids. And so she was in jail for some time and then in a women's shelter, and where she committed suicide. Anyway,
Wow.
I got nothing more.
That's, that again leaves you speechless, the repercussions. And that really is, I guess, the goal of why we are meeting here today, is to, in some small way, to prevent that. So what do we look forward to? We look forward to giving people a sense of belonging and to feel valuable and to be cared for. Wow.
And I guess the one positive out of that was a member of our church who advocated for people like that, who were here vulnerable to the laws and restrictions of our society. But
Yep. Well, thank you. Any other comments, questions, food for thought? Great words of wisdom for the rest of us and for the world that we're living in.
happy Thanksgiving.
Yes, that is coming up.
And I just want to let you know that my my holiday supply of lefse from Sly's Bakery arrived yesterday. It was a large box.
Well, you can send some over to Celebration Lutheran.
Oh, I have. Good.
Thank you. Hey, it's been great to be with you all again. And for those of you who will be listening to this, again, thank you for doing that. And I hope this generates some conversation and that we can, as a community, really come together more and more, and with a sense of belonging, a sense of awareness, and fortitude for developing relationships with each other all across cultures, races, and so forth. So thank you all for being with us today, and we look forward to you on December 17th, I believe, is the next time we get together. So thank you and have a great day.
Thanks,
you.
Dave.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Dave, for your facilitation.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll put together some questions and get them out to everyone.
Okay,
I
thank you.
assume we're doing the next chapter. Is that the basis of the questions?
Yeah,
Yep, I
Thank you.
believe so.
I'll read through it and go from there. Great.
All
Thanks,
right.
guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Ernie, where's my, there we go.